Now, occasionally you may find yourself in a situation where you would really prefer to have the full GUI interface when it comes time to go about configuring a server core instance. Or in other situations, you may find that a person has installed a server and perhaps installed it using the wrong version of the UI. Maybe they installed it with the full UI and you need to strip out that information so it's just a server core instance again. Previous versions of the operating system, this was something that's very difficult to do. It could involve an entire reinstall of the OS to switch from one version to the other. But with this version, with Server 2012 R2, we now have the ability to go about converting from server core to the full GUI and back again. This process involves that same dism command that we had used back in that last module. The dism command, as I'd said, is this Swiss Army knife for connecting to, making changes to, and then disconnecting from Windows images, both online images that are installed and offline images that you install from. Now, using this dism command, as I'd said back on that last module, there are a large number of parameters and various things that the command can do, and I don't want to get you overwhelmed with just that very long list. Many of those additional parameters will be handled in the 70-411 content as opposed to 70-410. But I do want to give you a quick introduction to how the command can be used for doing this conversion from server core to full GUI. Now recognize that we've talked before about the features on demand functionality with Windows Server and how features on demand actually removes the content from a Windows Server instance when any role or role service or feature has been removed from the system. And so if we attempted to here do install Windows feature, then a server GUI shell, if we attempted to do this, I'm going to do the what if command here, we'll notice after a very quick period of time that in fact we are unable to go about installing that Windows feature because, as you can see here, files for some of the features, the feature that we're attempting, are not available on the target server. They've essentially been removed from this target server. And so because of this, we need to actually make a connection to a copy of a Windows image that we can use to grab the files from. Over on our server file 1, I've gone about creating a share, the IT share on that location, that includes that information. And so let's actually go about connecting up to that remote share. That remote share I should be able to connect to with the netuse command. So I'll do netuse $, file1/IT. And as you'll notice, the command here has completed successfully, so we can now browse that X drive location. In the subfolder ISOs, there is essentially the ISO file for Windows Server 2012 R2, as well as an unpacked version of that ISO file as well. I've unpacked it because I need to actually get access to the contents inside that DVD ISO, as opposed to the ISO itself. As you can see here, here is the standard content that you would normally find inside of the Windows Server 2012 R2 DVD ISO. It is within this location, and specifically the sources subfolder, where all the content is. And in fact, if I point you directly to another file in this sources folder called install.wim, it is this very large install.wim file that contains what is effectively the entirety of Windows Server to be installed when it comes time to go through a standard Windows installation. It is this install.wim file that I need to attach to using the dism command so that I can mount the WIM file like a hard disk, access the information inside using the files and folders that exist inside of that WIM container. The first thing I need to do in order to be able to mount this WIM file is to create a location locally that I can use as a mount point. I can do so by doing mkdir c:, let's do mount. That creates a new folder here in the local machine on the C drive called mount. This is essentially going to be just a single location, a pointer that I can use for referencing all the files and folders that exist inside of the WIM container. With that done, I'm now ready to use the dism command to actually interrogate and then mount this install.wim file. The first thing I need to do is actually figure out what versions of the operating system are contained within that WIM container. I can do that with dism git wim info, WIM file, X, and then that'll be ISOs, unpacked, sources, and then install.wim. This should give me a list of all the different versions of the operating system that are concurrently contained inside of that WIM file. As you can see here, there are actually 4 different versions. There is the server data center, the server standard, the server data center core, and the server standard core. Now of these, the one that I'm looking for is in fact index number 2 because I'm needing to connect up with the instance of Windows, or to the instance of Windows inside of this WIM file that contains all the necessary bits so that I can grab the GUI portion of Windows and install it onto this machine. So recall this index number 2 here because we're going to use this in the next command we're using. That'll be dism, and then mount WIM, and then WIM file again, so x isos unpacked sources install.wim. The index then will be 2, because that's the version of the operating system we're looking for. And I'm going to point this to the mount directory that I just created of cmount, and I'm going to set it up as read-only. I always want to set this up as read-only if I have no intention of manipulating any of the files in the mount that I'm creating. If I've done everything correctly, dism will then look to the WIM file and make the connection between the WIM file and the mount point that I've pointed it towards. This process takes just a second or two, and after it's complete, we should be able to then actually take a look at the contents of that offline image by then referencing it from that C mount location. Let's go back over there. So in C, let's go to the mount location. And as you can see, this is the contents of that WIM file. The perf logs, the program files location, the Windows location, and everything we're used to seeing in a default instance of Microsoft Windows. Now, if you recall back in our last module when we were talking about installing Windows Server, there is a specific location inside of this Windows image that contains all the necessary bits that we now need to install onto this local machine, and that's the side-by-side folder. If I go into the Windows subfolder and then go to Win Side by Side, this is going to be the location where all of the different possible things that I could add onto a Windows server will exist. And so my final step in this process to install this Windows feature, the GUI part of Microsoft Windows, is to use the install Windows feature command, install Windows feature, again to server-GUI-shell. But in this case, I'm going to source or change the source location for these files to the mount point that I just created. So C mount Windows WinSXS. If I do this with the what if parameter, just so that we can pretend what would happen if we attempted to run this command, we'll take a look now to see if we could be successful with getting this machine converted over to the GUI mode. Now, one thing you may be noticing is that, well, gosh, Greg, we just got the exact same error message here after connecting up to our source files than we did before we ever even had a connection in using that dism command. And this actually introduces an interesting conundrum between the academia of what you need to know for the exam and the reality of what happens in the real world. Recall that between the time that I'm filming this and the time that Windows Server 2012 R2 was released, there have been a number of updates to the Windows Server, just the core code of what is Windows Server itself. And so in circumstances where you may find yourself attempting to point an already updated version of Windows Server to an older version of the Windows source files, you can end up with a similar situation like what we see here, where some of the files for these features is just simply not available. This is a common situation when you find your image files not being kept up to date with all of the other updates that come from time to time from Microsoft. So I'm showing you this because it's necessary for the exam, but recognize that for this to really function, number one, you would need to complete this with a connection to Microsoft so that the remaining missing files could be downloaded, or with a completely updated ISO file so that you have all the expected updated files that this command is looking for. I guess the short answer here is something my dad used to say. There's a difference between book smarts and wisdom, and the wisdom is recognizing that the real world things change a lot. So if this is the process to go from server core to server, let's now explore the slightly more easy process of going from server to server core. Let me pop back over here onto my other machine, again, very long series of letters and numbers. And let me bring up a PowerShell command prompt here in administrator mode, because I want to show you just a very simple command you can use. It's just the inverse of the command we've already used. Remove Windows feature. And then in order to remove the Windows feature, we actually have a couple of different components that we need to remove. That server GUI shell is the one we were looking at before. We also want to remove server GUI management infrastructure, or infra. That is the other components that are commonly associated with the GUI version of the Windows operating system, things like Server Manager. If I run what if here, you'll see that, well, this process is much, much easier to remove than it is to add because, well, we're just removing things, deleting things off of this machine. So that'll get you from one version to the other and from the other version back again. Again, the reason why we're talking about this is because occasionally, sometimes you may have the need to get yourself bootstrapped up into a GUI mode to complete some configuration when you just don't feel like doing it at the command line or with PowerShell. And then when you're done, if you feel the need to, then you can remove all of those GUI bits to return yourself back to a server core installation.